This is the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We chat about software development for mobile, HDTV, wearables, robotics, user experience, mentoring, and everything related to building products and services for the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode 10 of the Web Platform Podcast, Mathematics and Dynamic CSS Visualizations. Today our guests are Anna Tudor, at TheBabyDino on Twitter, and she is a math and geometry lover, and often describes herself as not friendly at all. She enjoys playing and exploring with code on CodePen, and Anna is also very passionate about experimenting and learning new things. And she recently spoke at CSS Day in 2014 here on 3D transforms. Our second guest is David Walsh, at David Walsh blog, all one word. Originally from Madison, Wisconsin, David is a web developer evangelist at Mozilla and technical author of the David Walsh blog and MooTools core developer. Go MooTools! That was like my favorite JavaScript library back in the day. And David has spoken at many conferences and meetups, including Brazil.js, London Ajax, Austin.js, and many more. And CSS visualizations will dramatically change. So how they will change, that's debatable. But they will inevitably enable developers to do a lot more than they may think. We may see custom properties like variables to improve dry, don't repeat yourself coding, and on-the-fly cascading calculations, which is great. Hopefully that'll come through. But there's also stuff that's very little known, like CSS Extensions. So that'll allow us to create our own custom selector properties, custom functions, and custom selector combinations. So for visualizations, that would be crazy. Some of these rules are even starting to be implemented in browsers today, like will-change, a spec that Tab Atkins proposed to pre-optimize changes in DOM structures, and CSS Shapes, which will help us to further display the display and flow and wrapping of content across different containers and the containers that they are in and around, which is very powerful. I mean, that combined with CSS figures, as Sarah Swayden talked about in the Web Ahead and Shop Talk show, that's some pretty crazy stuff that's happening in the browsers. So these are going to help to further define those things. And CSS is moving very rapidly. This is just the tip of what is to come in web development for the next years, and in some cases, months. It used to be that to create powerful visualizations in the browser, you would need Flash or some non-standard tool to get performance and consistency that you needed from complex animations. So this was difficult not only for developers, but for designers as well. So today we have help bridging the gaps for tomorrow. CSS Preprocessors have given us features for our CSS code that'll help out. Some of the notable ones are loops, conditionals, variables, custom mixins and functions, heavy-grade math calculations. So while these are extremely useful, they only help us currently before you even see CSS in the browser. So that means that they're done on server side, let's say. So it generates a CSS file. So it doesn't really change things like you would need as they change inside the DOM. So the page loads and your CSS preprocessor can't help you once the CSS loads currently. I mean, that may change if browsers actually implement SCSS or stylus or anything like that. But currently, that's the way it is. We also have tools like CodePen.io, which is an online tool that can help us build rapidly and view CSS, HTML, and JavaScript for proof of concepts, prototyping, or even if you're building out real visualizations to share with people. It makes it very easy to pass along to others and set up. So it eliminates the overhead of understanding setup, web development concepts that are more at the level of setup and building processes and dependency management. So that eliminates all of that stuff, which can be intimidating for a lot of people. So although extremely powerful, this means that the tools that we have, like CSS preprocessors and online display tools like CodePen.io, looking at today's CSS standards, we now have ways of doing some dynamic calculation and conditions in the browser and device viewers today. So directives like @supports, which is a conditional to determine if there's a CSS support for something, which is great, and @media, which I'm sure most of you web developers are all familiar with. That gives us the power to do media queries. So it's very powerful stuff. We also have different types of units. So not just like viewport units, which everyone seems to know, which are great. I love them. But there's also frequency units, time units, if you've done the keyframe animations, and resolution units, which are part of the media queries that you probably do. So rules like Calc give us the ability to computationally react to mutations in the DOM tree, which is great. Very powerful rule that's highly underused. Of course, if you have IE8 or older versions of some of the mobile browsers, you may have some difficulty with that, but Calc is great beyond IE9 and I believe Android 4, I'm not sure exactly, but somewhere in there. So keyframe directives, which I just mentioned briefly, that gives us robust animation. The transform rule yields great power to set up and animate DOM structures, and also dynamically change rotation, skewing, scaling, and translation both in the plane and in the 3D space, all without one line of JavaScript. So that said, few people have really mastered this interactive art, and that's why we're here today. So Anna is one of those people, excuse me, in my humble opinion. Seeing her incredible work on her CodePen account that's done this, and she doesn't even consider herself a web developer, but she does a lot of web developer-like stuff, and that many of us strive to understand and recreate and improve upon. So Anna, can you just give us a brief explanation of how you even got started in CSS? How did you work with this?
It was an accident. I didn't even know it was called CSS. It was one night and I was loaded and I wanted something cold to drink, something cold and sweet. So I went to a shop and got some juice, except the refrigerators were just furniture. They were not plugged in. So I was pissed and I came home and I started a blog because I wanted to shame them on the internet and I wanted the whole world to know what greedy bastards they were. Except, as I said, it was late at night, so I never wrote that blog post. I fell asleep. But I already had a blog which stayed empty for some months until I started writing about Formula One and music.
Mm-hmm.
And about a year later, I thought, well, maybe it's time to give it a new look. So I went into the dashboard and I saw something like edit HTML, and the CSS part was inside style tags in the head. And I thought certain things in there looked pretty self-explanatory, like width, margins, and paddings, and stuff like that, and background and color. And I started changing things. I didn't know that was called CSS. I had no idea what that shit was. I just noticed it did have something to do with the aspect of the page. So I just started changing things. And of course, looking self-explanatory to me is one thing, but I had no clue what I was doing, and I completely broke things. And I had no clue what that was, and so nobody to ask for help. So I just had to search on the internet for the things I had changed and to find answers and fix things because there was nobody to fix it for me.
That's
And
great. It's the willingness to break things that makes us learn better, right?
maybe, I don't know.
Sometimes. And David, how did you get started with CSS?
I don't know, like back in the late 90s, um, I saw a website that I liked, and an error came up once, and this was before anybody did good error handling, and it had like the actual page code pop up. I was like, oh, that's awesome. Um, so I can't really tell you why I got into it. I was just super excited about it, and I spent like that whole summer vacation learning how to do HTML and CSS, and I loved it then and I love it now, and it's just kept, snowballing up into today.
And you've been doing it for quite a while.
Yes, I'm getting old.
No, I mean it's great because your blog has been a great asset to a lot of us out there.
Thank you.
And as far as like CSS2, I know when I started, it was you'd think of it as like Anna was pointing out that we have the margins and the paddings, the box model, right? That's and that took a while to get used to even, but people thought of it as just this is window dressing, and you're just taking your markup and just making it look nicer and prettier. But that's really changing a lot lately. I see a lot of artwork, a lot of experiments, and detailed mathematical visualizations, such as Anna's CodePens and examples online using WebGL and SVG to do some of these things. But it's amazing to me, specifically CSS, and how we've sort of changed how we look at it. Recently, Chrome added unprefixed the CSS animations, as you guys pointed out on Twitter, which I thought was great. I didn't even realize though.
Transforms with 36.
Yeah, it was 36, right?
And actually, Firefox did that a long time ago. Remove prefixes.
Yeah, that was in 2012.
Pioneers. So
yeah, it's amazing how CSS has gone from simple changing of colors onto layouts, and now we're doing amazing things with CSS, and we're avoiding JavaScript altogether.
Yeah, why do we think that is?
Everything needs to develop and become more powerful. The fact that forever we needed to use JavaScript to do a simple fade in, fade out. We look back at it now and we just sort of laugh that that's something that we needed to do. But again, as we push the limits of our websites and web development, we need to empower the more basic tools to do more things.
What is
Just one thing I want to say. When I said transforms, I meant transforms got unprefixed, not animations in Chrome.
Mm-hmm.
Animations are still prefixed. As far as I know, they got unprefixed for a little while last autumn, but I don't know. Maybe that wasn't ready. I don't know what happened. Then they got prefixed again, and then something broke because prefix detection for animations broke. Because if you try to do prefix detection for animations, it said that it supported unprefixed, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And that broke certain prefix detection tools.
Is Firefox going to be getting rid of prefixes altogether? Because I heard that the Blink team was going to not use them moving forward as they create new CSS rules.
Right. Most everything in Firefox has been unprefixed at this point.
Most things that get used a lot. Yeah.
How far
Right.
back? How far back does that go for the? Do you know which version of Firefox that started happening?
I don't know the specific version, but Anna mentioned that it was 2012. So.
Okay.
15, 16, I think around 15, 16 was the transitions, transforms, and animations around that version, and that was the autumn of 2012.
Okay.
That sounds correct.
All right.
And there's a lot of difference in what people would use for what, but it seems like it's sort of leveling out. Do you guys see that, like with transitions versus transforms versus keyframes? Like, when would you use any of them?
I use transitions whenever possible, just because I guess the syntax is more simple, because I'm usually doing simple things. But if you're doing some pretty crazy stuff, you're going to want to use animations.
And so talking about when to use which. So there are, so for example, Chrome browser on Android and native Android browser sometimes will run just straight transition animations, pretty janky. do you know of any ways to get around some of these things, or do you know any places where, because so what I'm saying is, so like the transition, if you use transitions, things won't animate smoothly all the time, but if you use keyframes, generally they will. Do you know of any other situations where things like that might be necessary?
Well, you can use Translate 3D to push into hardware acceleration if you need to, but I've actually not experienced those types of issues.
Really?
I suppose if you do some testing and you notice that it's a problem, you could unfortunately revert to using an animation library to do your animations and see if that works out a little bit better. Or you could try and write the vanilla JavaScript to do the animation yourself. But I've never, sort of run into that issue.
Okay.
Have you guys ever played with using @supports to kind of to get like a class, let's say, like animate.css has some great transitions, I thought, where you just, does class switching, right? And then when the class gets changed, the animation triggers and runs. So you could probably have like a, @supports or even a media query, depending. And then inside of that, change the definition of that rule. Have you experimented with different ways to do that?
I haven't.
No, and neither have I. So maybe I'm lucky enough where I haven't had to get to that point yet. But I do see something like animate.css being a huge asset to both developers looking to learn and ways of sort of experimenting with different effects.
Animate.css is pretty cool, especially when wanting to learn like the keyframe style animations. It's really well marked up. It's really well, very cleanly written. So when I first started looking into some of that stuff, that's one of the things I found.
Absolutely.
I
And
think
then
it's Daniel Eden, right? Who wrote that
um,
one?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
yeah. And then especially with things like Eric, like you were talking about these animation things. So like Angular has something called ng-animate, which will add these classes to, so if you want to slide a view in and out, or you want certain thing to fade in instead of just appear, you can it automatically adds classes to your markup for you, and then you just have to attach your own styles to those classes, and you can get some pretty sweet animations out of that stuff. All ng-animate does is add classes. So Angular has its animate stuff, and it is leveraging that to pretty much to add all the classes and stuff for you, so you don't have to mess with it.
Okay.
It's pretty handy.
And Danny, I don't know if you had a chance to check out Anna's CodePens.
Unfortunately, no. I meant to, but I kind of got swamped this week. But I've heard good things.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Anna is a superstar of CodePen.
Yeah.
Oh, I've heard.
So like in your CodePens, Anna, you experiment with a lot of really cool math. And to be honest, I saw your CSS Day video on Vimeo, and I was blown away. I felt incapable of doing any math after that. It was pretty awesome though. Can you talk about how you leveraged SAS and Compass to do a lot of this stuff?
Well, I hadn't even heard about preprocessors until I started using CodePen a bit more. At first, I was using it mostly for JavaScript stuff. Back then, I still had my old laptop, and that's a really old one because I've had it since 2006, and I've barely changed it now. And that had widescreen and not such a great resolution. And back then, CodePen still only had the horizontal split, and the area at the bottom was really narrow for my old laptop, so I didn't use it that much. But when I discovered CodePen and saw others people's demos and they were using preprocessors, I felt kind of pissed, left behind, because I couldn't understand that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was stuck between having a knee-jerk reaction, I can write CSS, I don't need preprocessors, and the desire of understanding what other people were doing. And I also thought that the idea of looping and having logic in CSS was pretty cool because I wanted to do all those things I could do in JavaScript, but do them with CSS. And preprocessors were way to that.
So was it just because it was pretty cool and fun, or and a good experiment, or was there like some benefit that CSS may have given you over JavaScript?
First of all, I think I suck at JavaScript.
Don't we all?
So I thought I'd go with something that I knew somewhat better. But as time goes by and you discover more and more things done by other people, you start to feel more and more stupid. And damn, I miss the days when I felt so smart for animating max width instead of animating to auto, because you can't animate to auto, you need a value. So I was animating from 0 to max. So I miss those days. But the thing is, the best thing about this is that I don't have to copy paste as much.
Yeah.
I can just generate a lot of stuff in a loop. And I've done stuff like 3D surfaces. I couldn't have done those without SAS because that's hundreds of elements, each one with a different transform, and they're all generated in a loop. And
So you're using Haml as well in a lot of them?
yes.
Okay.
And it was the same. I didn't know what I was doing. I just, picked out a few people who were doing SAS stuff, and I came up with the logic for the CSS, and then I opened up their SAS pens and tried to figure out what in there could help me do what I wanted. But I didn't look into the documentation or anything like that. I just tried to pick out of other people's pens. So steal a bit and put into mine.
Yeah, it's great to have stuff like your CodePens out there where people can see the code, um, and GitHub, and that's why they can actually take it, copy it, and play with it, and even fork the CodePen, and just see how it works and break it down, like you said. I've heard the argument that about preprocessors, because you said a little earlier that you didn't see the purpose of them, right, until you had this issue with these large things, and that's a very good use case. But I've heard it from people who use object-oriented CSS and patterns like SMAX, that I know CSS preprocessors is for people who don't understand CSS.
That's what everybody says until they use SAS or less for the first time, and then they wonder how they ever got along without it after the
Yeah.
fact. It's because I was exactly like that too. I saw a bunch of people using preprocessors, especially SAS, and everybody's like, "It's great, it's great." And I'm like, "I know how to write CSS. I don't need this stuff." And then somebody was like, "All right, just go watch this video and see some of the cool stuff that they can do." And you start like Anna said, you start looping through stuff, and you're like, "Holy crap, that just saved me so much time." And ever since the first time I used SAS, I rarely ever write vanilla JavaScript anymore. I mean CSS anymore.
David, what was your experience with preprocessors?
So I've used them all actually. I used SAS for a while, but one thing that sort of bugged me about it is that it required Ruby. And I know there's like a C module so that you don't need Ruby, but I opted to use in my recent projects Stylus.
Stylus
And
is nice.
Stylus is really nice, and it's got a Node API. I went down the wrong path with SAS, in my first time using it, because preprocessors, however nice they are, they do give you the ability to hang yourself. So for example, I started nesting selectors that didn't need to be nested, and suddenly my CSS file was like 50K when it could have been half that. So that was one mistake that I had made, but overall, CSS preprocessors have been very good to me. And, I was able to build an easy grid system using Stylus and their mixins and such. So I don't know how I got by without them now. Our websites are getting so complex that using static CSS files really isn't useful anymore, or I should say it's not very efficient anymore. And a lot of them actually come with good minification as well. So, I mean, they've just gotten so beefed up that not using one seems foolish at this point.
Even I mean, think about the build processes for front end development a few years ago compared to now. So you're talking about preprocessors, but we use we use Grunt and Gulp and all these other full on build processes that front end intensive applications are extremely invaluable.
As far as my experience with the preprocessors was that I was in a large Ruby project the first time I used SAS, and that was the first preprocessor I got to play with. And we had those giant nested selectors, like you were saying, David, and it was brutal for the performance. And the team was mostly Ruby developers who didn't really care so much about the front end as much as maybe a front end developer would. So it was more like what works and what's best for the team. Let's do that. And we didn't even know at that time what would be the best practice. And we found out that if you don't understand CSS at the core, you can really easily fall into those problems. But I do see a great value in that, combined with patterns like OOCSS.
Totally, yeah.
Variables were talked about at one point, maybe. I forgot how long ago it was, but myth.io came out and like, oh, we have you can start using CSS variables now. So I've heard that there's a difference in using SAS variables and using something like CSS variables. What do you guys think about that?
So I thought about it a lot, and when I saw the original spec come out, the one that they're gonna go with,
Yeah.
I didn't like it because it was a lot different and it seemed a bit verbose. But after thinking about it for a while, I came to the realization that all of the CSS preprocessors will probably let you, keep writing CSS in that way and then export variables into your style sheets if it made sense.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that I don't care because I think that adding CSS variables is important, but the implementation seems less important to me because, again, the preprocessors will probably help us along with that.
Yeah, the variables help so much to help with that cascading piece I found. And then you can do, in SAS at least, you can have math, based on those variables. So if you have like a base padding or a base width that you just set globally, then everything else you can adjust throughout the application, and even pass that into a function that might do some calculations on that. A mix-in, they're typically called in SAS. I found that the documentation for SAS was probably led me to want to use it the most because Stylus, I felt like, had a lot of really cool features, but I had to really search hard to find good information about it. And it didn't seem as extensible, like as far as people creating good plugins for it and good examples.
I need my curly braces.
Yeah, well, SAS when I started didn't even have the curly braces either.
Oh, wasn't
It was,
that?
yeah, the .sas files.
Yeah, instead of the SCSS files.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel the same way about stuff like Python, which is one of the reasons I'm not as big of a fan of things like Stylus because I need my curly braces. It's just so ingrained in me to put them in there. As soon as I get rid of them, it takes me a while to assimilate.
One of the cool things about using Ruby SAS, particularly in Compass, which I see a lot of Anna's CodePens utilizing, is the math functions that are underneath. So it basically exposes the Ruby API for math. It's really saddens me that libsas, the C version of SAS, doesn't have that math to do these things. I think I had a thing on Twitter where I was talking about this, and I asked Anna about it. Have you guys heard anything about libsas actually implementing any of this stuff?
The thing is, you can write them yourself, all those mathematical functions, because Compass, for example, doesn't have inverse trigonometric functions. So I wrote those myself for my use.
Yeah, but for the performance gain you would get from libsass, I would
Uh,
think that you would want to
yeah,
have it at the low level, where it's
yeah,
just, at that C level.
yeah. Performance-wise, I can't compete with that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the compass is great because it does have that, and you can create your own. And like you said, even with SAS, the later versions, you can add instead of mixins, you can have functions, which adds more functionality in addition to the mixins. What did you use before compass, Anna?
Uh, there was no before.
So did you write? Were you able to write your own? Did you make like SAS functions through Ruby?
No, the thing is, I don't think I've written code outside of an online playground since late 2011.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when it all started to be online for me, and I haven't used anything outside an online editor since then.
Now you have the Pro edition of CodePen, right? So I'm wondering, are maybe they would allow you to actually have those files hosted on the server?
I don't know. I don't even know how that works. So
CodePen's great though. I used to use JS Fiddle all the time, and just CodePen's just so much nicer for overall working with
yeah,
front end.
yeah. I discovered JS Fiddle in late 2011, and that was life-changing, I have to say,
Yeah, it was the first of its kind that I had seen.
because after I discovered it, I thought it really sucked to have to create the files and have them clutter your hard drive, and oh no.
There must be a better way. So, if anyone who's trying to do visualizations for web pages, or even to experiment on CodePen or anything like that, how do you go about handling what tools or approaches you might take to a particular vision that you have for these things? It's a question for both you, Anna and David.
I don't actually use web tools.
Okay. Well, you use CSS, right? That's a web tool.
First of all, I use this and this.
What is this and this? I'm sorry.
This is a notebook.
All right.
These are fine liners,
So
colorful.
you sketch it out first on
Yep.
physical medium,
Yep.
which is awesome.
I draw it. I write down some particular cases, how they would go from start to finish, and then I try to come up with an algorithm for the general case. And that's what I actually code in SAS.
That's pretty awesome.
It's also just kind of nice to have that physical, especially when you were saying you do everything online, everything exists online. It's nice to almost have a physical memento almost of some of these things that you're doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're always putting post-its up and drawing little pictures on them and little cartoons and things to get ideas moving. So I can totally relate with that. That's pretty great.
And I always loved this part because geometry was my favorite tool. And back when I was in school, computers weren't a big deal for me. In fact, computers weren't a big deal for me until less than 10 years ago. Because I discovered this whole thing rather recently. Although my first time into programming was on a home computer with Basic S, and which I got when I was around 9, almost 10, 9 something, 23rd of December 1993. And I got a home computer and a tiny booklet with samples of programs I could write. And I went through that booklet and got all those done. And then I started doing my own thing. And among the things that I was doing then was generating all sorts of geometric shapes with loops, with looping. And so that was my first contact with this. But I didn't actually have a PC until 98, late 98. And I didn't even hear about the internet until the end of 2001, December 2001. And that was strictly because I wanted to apply to universities, and somebody told me I could email them, and I had no idea what that meant. So she took me to an internet cafe, and I was like an idiot, and she she was doing all sorts of these faces and going, "Oh my God, you don't know this. Oh my God, you don't know this. Oh my God, you don't know this." She was like that for about half an hour, and I was
Nice.
looking like a complete idiot at everything she was doing. And I didn't have internet at home until late 2006, and then discovered CSS about 5 years ago, and only started getting serious with CSS in late 2011. So,
David, what's your process? How do you go about it?
I'm completely opposite of Anna, and my process is not amazing. I'm one of those people that just like dives into the code and starts writing something. So I don't really plan much out, um, which is very much not a brag. But I just like jump into it and start playing and tinkering and do things piece by piece and see how everything reacts. And as far as what tool I use, it sort of depends on the job, just like everything else. I might use something very simple like Snap SVG if I want to do SVG animation. Um, you know, the other thing that we have to weigh not only is a task, but the support that we want to have for the task that we're doing. Um, the most advanced animation stuff I've done has actually been with the Dojo Toolkit. They have like a little sub project called GFX. And so with that, I've done charting and I've done a lot of really awesome animations. And the cool thing about GFX is that you can tell it has one unified API, right? So if you want it to output canvas, that's just one setting that you need to tick. If you want to output SVG, that's another setting. VML, like Silverlight, has support for all of that stuff, which is really nice. And it actually has logic to detect which one of those would be maybe the most performant or the best for that device. So if I ever need to do something advanced, I end up using GFX. But that's my process. I just sort of like go, go, go.
It sounds like it's nice to have such a like an API that's like it works like a DSL, right? Where it's you have this one API. You just say to it, "I want to make an animation, and here's what I want," rather than okay, now I have to get these specific SVG tools or these specific WebGL tools or or CSS tools. It just does
Sure.
it for you.
Yeah, the downfall is not being great with vanilla, like Canvas and such, but that's something that can come along the way.
So it can be daunting though for people starting out doing visualizations who are not necessarily experienced with it. So what are some benefits or pitfalls to look out for as far as like, oh, you would probably use SVG for this because of X, Y, and Z, or you'd probably use CSS because of X, Y, and Z, or JavaScript even?
Well, luckily, right, well, the first step is making sure you know what you're trying to support.
Yeah.
Which browsers, how far back, which mobile, and that will get you a lot of the way there. But the rest is research. I mean, it's getting to the point now where the newer Internet Explorers support SVG. So, that's a big bonus, as well as Canvas. So we're sort of getting to the point where we can choose which tool that we want instead of having it dictated to us by the different browsers. But I guess, as always, my big suggestion is do research and tinker around on CodePen and look for likewise animations that you'd like to make and see how somebody awesome like Anna has done it. And I think that'll get people most of the way there.
Yeah, one of the cool features I thought about CodePen, one of the reasons I did do Pro for a little bit was they do have a feature on there for pair programming and mentoring. So you can go in and you can work with people collaboratively at the same time, which is great on something like CodePen where you get that instant gratification of seeing what your code did. Anna or David, have you guys used that feature?
I have not.
Yeah, I've used it. I've used both collab and professor mode. Professor mode, it was a lot of it. It was for fun because I had some moments when I just scratched my head and I thought, well, this looks interesting. So I started a pen and then I dropped a link on Twitter if anybody wants to see me live coding this. And it was mostly for fun. It wasn't anything serious.
I
But I
think
just
it's really helpful though for at least for me. Like I would love to do that because then I get to see your process of how you're coding it. Oh, okay. Well, now she's doing this, and what's that she's doing, and then I could maybe email you or send you. I think they have a messaging thing in there.
and I used it as a sort of training for live coding during conferences because I also time myself while doing this because when I'm doing a talk, I have I have limited time, so whatever I'm doing, I have to fit it within that time. So timing myself while I'm doing this for fun
Yeah.
actually helped.
One thing that's great is working together. I've done a lot of pair programming with Danny and Christian Smith, another developer who's a host on here. We've been doing it for a while now, and it's so helpful to not be in like a silo and going back and forth. Even if you're doing ping pong style of pair programming, or you're just switching the doing one person's testing and one person's actually implementing. There's different variants like you said you draw before, so
Yeah.
if you have like a video camera too, you can start sketching out stuff and showing it, and that person could be coding and collaborating that way. It's really awesome stuff that we have today that we didn't have a few years ago.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder whether stuff came out of nowhere or I just wasn't aware of it earlier
I know what you mean.
because it's really weird. And the greatest thing about doing stuff on the internet is that it's so easy to learn new things. There are so many resources. And sure, sometimes as you advance, you get into areas and there are things that aren't so well documented and you have to dig out everything yourself, but it takes a while to get there. Most things are pretty well documented, and that's great because it really helps with the learning. But one thing I've noticed for myself, it's also a lesson in humility because GitHub serves that every day. You see other people's code and you think, damn, I wish I could write code like that. Damn, I wish I could do that. And it's not so much about the result because I saw a pen a couple of days ago and I think I even tweeted about it. It's not so much the result because it wasn't anything amazing, but the performance was great. I couldn't have done that. I could have achieved the same thing, looking just the same, moving just the same, but the performance was amazing. I couldn't have done that.
Right, and to see that code even after that realization, I'm sure you probably looked at the code and said, well, what can I do from this, right?
I thought, oh no, kill me now.
But so kind of along those lines, especially for people that are maybe just starting and then they do. So I did finally go and look at honest stuff on CodePen while we were doing this, and I felt bad about myself. So, but so people that are just starting out wanting to learn this stuff, what are your suggestions for not getting frustrated when you see something like these crazy things that that Anna is doing? How do you keep your head on your shoulders and keep going forward, or rather than just getting enormously frustrated and stopping?
I'm like super driven, and when I see something awesome, it's the same thing that I did when I was 14 and I first learned web programming. I saw something awesome and I said, I need to learn how to do that. So I think it's just sort of internal drive to create something awesome, and knowing that one, you get to see that awesome thing when you're done, and two, you're going to be able to build on that and continue to make awesome stuff. I don't ever hold out hope that I'll be as good as Anna, because her math skills are ridiculous. But Anna's also got the creativity to put something together, so that is really cool too. But it just comes down to personal drive, and it also comes down to, if you really want to learn something, putting yourself in a position where you have to learn it. like, selling a freelance project where you tell somebody, I'm going to make this for you. When you put yourself under that gun, that'll really make you learn. But again, just like everything else in our business, it comes down to personal drive. If you want to be great at something, you're going to work as hard as you need to get there.
It's very true. Very true. One thing we didn't talk about as far as CSS goes and using math was the calc function and units. So there's lots of different units that have been introduced into CSS since the days of use pixels for everything. How have you guys been using calc, or have you? What's typical use cases?
I've used it a lot lately, especially in combination with viewport units.
Yeah.
Because I've wanted to do various things. For example, one thing that I wanted to do, because of doing talks and needing to do slideshows that are fully flexible, but at the same time, I can't. The first thing I did when I started doing a slideshow, I thought, well, I'll make it fully flexible, so I'll set the base font in viewport units, which is great, but sometimes it doesn't look the same for different aspect ratios. So I thought then let's fix the aspect ratio to the most common projector aspect ratio. But I want this to always cover the screen. One of the dimensions always covers the screen. So how I did this was using the calc function and viewport units. And I actually have a pen, and I'll link to it, doing this. And another thing that I did at a certain point, I wanted a sort of a grid, but starting from the center. And I thought I'd do this with linear gradients, but I can't exactly position it, the linear gradient, without using calc and viewport units. So that was another thing I've used it for.
Did you find when you were using calc for certain rules like position or margin or padding or anything like that, that it worked in some cases and didn't work in others?
For line height, it doesn't still work in Firefox, calc for line height. And I ran across that while doing my slideshow also.
There was an article on CSS tricks. I think Chris Croyer wrote about calc when he talked about nesting the calcs inside of each other. Because when I first played with it, I was like, oh, this is cool. I can add 10 pixels plus 100%. And I think I read something on David's blog actually on calc as well.
In my current blog design and the failed attempts to redesign before, I was able to use Calc to create grid layouts for my site, to make my site, more responsive and avoid using media queries. And I had a good amount of success with that. I do rage a little bit that viewport units aren't yet more widely supported. I feel like that's one of those things over the years that we've known that we've needed for a long time, and for some reason they just haven't come, sort of like Flexbox for all of our layout problems. But I think that we're getting there, and Calc is a lot of fun to play around with.
Yeah, I've only used it with percentages, pixels, ems, rems. I haven't played with it with points or x height, points, x heights, inches, centimeters, any of that stuff. But I would imagine for different, types of projects that might be, if you're doing something architectural, you want to have a scaled version of something, something that requires that detail that you might need to use for centimeters or millimeters.
And David, you just mentioned Flexbox, which is my favorite thing and makes me really upset that we can't, if it has to be supported in any kind of larger scope, can't be used yet. So how come? So talking about something like Flexbox and something like Calc or the view, other units and things like that. Why do you think they aren't as widely supported as we would like them to be?
I think a big part of it is wanting to make sure that they nail down the spec. So I think what they want to do is like perfect it spec-wise and then sort of implement it under a vendor prefix before they send it out, because there's a lot of, for example, gradients changed a lot too, but they're not used a ton. But if you take something like layout that is absolutely crucial to a website, and you put something out that isn't great or that's going to be changing frequently, you're just going to really frustrate people. And that feature is going to lose steam before it can even pick it up.
So as far as like the CSS stuff, pushing the envelope and people who are doing, like yourselves who are doing really great projects with some of the newer CSS stuff, like what are some awesome CSS things that you guys have seen that push the limits?
I can take the easy way out and say everything that Anna has done on CodePen is a good way to push the limits.
True story.
Yeah, I find her really inspiring, so I think that maybe she would be better to answer that question.
She's searching now.
Thing is, I don't really take the inspiration from CSS, from other CSS stuff. It's more stuff that's not CSS and can you reproduce this with CSS kind of challenges that I get. That's the really challenging and inspiring part, because nobody has done it before, and that's what makes it a really tasty prize.
I think going through CodePens though in general and seeing what people do with CSS is really interesting, and it gives you a lot of ideas. At least for me, with oh wow, that's pretty amazing. I'd like to actually see how that would work with this other thing I'm using. Have you found that when you guys are going through?
Absolutely. Like, I'm not the creative type. I generally say that I'm like 90% programmer and 10% designer. So I draw a lot of my inspiration from stuff that I see out there, and then I end up tweaking it for my use case, or, just if I have an idea I want to use. So I generally lean on the creativity of other people.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I need to get it from somebody else. And luckily, I get fed a lot of challenges.
So, on those lines, so Anna, you said you try to take inspiration from things that that maybe aren't done in CSS, and try to see if you can reproduce that same whatever
Yeah.
it is. And based on looking into your CodePen, it doesn't seem like there have been many things you haven't been able to reproduce. Have you run across a particular challenge that was, if not impossible for you to do, that proved particularly difficult?
Four-dimensional stuff. Really, yeah. There was a YouTube video of 4D stuff, and I tried to reproduce it, and it really didn't work. But I have a long, long list of private pens that I never got to finish, or at least bring to a point where they were good enough. There are a ton of things.
She is human.
Is there anything that you two, or even Danny too, think that is missing from CSS that may be helpful for the work that you guys are doing?
It's gonna sound flippant, but with CSS preprocessors helping us shim so much, it's not something that I generally worry too much about. I mean, there's stuff out there like position sticky. It would be good for us to get that in, so we don't have to, you know, listen for scroll events and move stuff when it needs to be moved. But for me, it's a lot of little stuff right now. I think that like Flexbox is coming along, and the viewport units and Calc, that stuff is getting wider support. So I feel pretty good right now about the state of CSS. But of course, I don't want it to stagnate, so I do enjoy seeing things move forward.
Yeah, I saw Leah Veroux and at Modev UX recently, and her talk on color. I don't know if you guys have seen that with CSS was fantastic. It was really inspiring. She talked about the different color models and how we tend to misuse color in CSS, and she had some polyfills in SAS for fixing color and certain things.
I'm hoping that conic gradients will become a reality, because for now we only have linear and radial. That's one thing that would be really cool. And it would simplify a lot of things, because I can emulate conic gradients with SAS, but that means a lot of linear gradients, one on top of the other. So why have a few hundred linear gradients to emulate one conic gradient?
Good
That
point.
doesn't make sense.
So can you explain exactly what a conic gradient is and
Um,
why you want it?
so it would be something that, think about something like a pie, and along the edges of a slice of a pie, you have a color, and it blends into the other in the middle of the slice of the pie. Something like that.
Okay.
So we're running short on time. I wanted to just to thank you guys for coming. Is there anything that we missed or that we should talk about as far as math and the work you guys have been doing with CSS or visualizations in general?
I would tell people not to surrender when they see Anna's work. So
Indeed.
someday we'll get that good too.
Maybe.
Maybe.
I think I need a reminder not to surrender when I see other people's work. I do feel like that a lot.
I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse.
So if people want to contact you guys, how can they find you to chat with you or to find more stuff about you?
My website is at davidwalsh.name, and you can find me on Twitter at davidwalshblog.
I'm the Baby Dino, both on Twitter and CodePen. That's one word, the Baby Dino. And it's inspired by dinosaur cartoons. I wish it had a more interesting story, but it doesn't.
Dinosaur cartoons are great.
For those listening, we're on a Google Hangout, and Anna, for the whole episode, has been unseen except in cat form. There is a cat hovering in front of the camera, speaking.
I have a cat. I have a huge tiger all over me, and it's bigger than me.
And it's been quiet this whole time.
He's fluffy. He's always fluffy.
But we'll definitely put links to both to Anna's CodePen and to David's website and their Twitter. We'll make sure we put those in the show notes as well.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It was an honor to talk to you guys, and we thank you, and anybody that actually listens to this, I'm sure, is really excited to hear from you all too.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff that you guys are doing out there, so I appreciate it. This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3 Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3 the number, pillarglobal.com.